Well, hello and welcome to week number 4 of our Real Life Emotions series. We've talked about a lot of different emotions so far. We've talked about grief. We've talked about fear. Last week we talked about joy. This week we're going to talk about something a little different, which is anger. Right? And anger is kind of a tricky subject to talk about, right? Because anger is something that we don't want to have in our lives. It's not fun to be angry, usually because we have something to be angry about. And so we're going to kind of talk about anger from a Christian perspective, right? And so what we're going to talk about this morning is not about getting rid of anger. What we're going to talk about this morning is how to redirect anger. Anger is one of those things that we may be tempted to justify, claiming that Jesus was angry at times. However, we have to be careful not to confuse righteous anger, that which is concerned exclusively with the glory of God, with selfish anger, which is concerned with me or my feelings. And when Christians justify any sin, whether it's selfish anger or something else, this may not cut us off from God in an eternal sense, but we can certainly interrupt the relational intimacy that we enjoy with the Father when we try to justify sin in our lives. It causes us to miss out on many of the blessings that God desires for us. He refuses our prayers when we harbor sin, specifically malice, which is closely related to anger and hatred in our hearts. And we see that in Psalm 66, verse 18. And so what that means for us is that we should take great care to live like Jesus and trust in Him to live in connection with God. And so, as we think through anger, we see that when we deal with difficult situations, we're sometimes tempted to be angry. But God calls us to avoid unrighteous anger and leave matters in His hands. Right? Sometimes our anger comes from a lack of trust in the sovereignty of God. Right? We can get angry when we feel unjustly treated, and sometimes that stems from a place of we forget that God is the one who will ultimately bring true justice, right? And so, I think when we think about anger, I know a lot of us have younger siblings. I'm the oldest child in my family. I have one younger sibling. I know a lot of us have younger siblings, and some of us are the youngest, but we still grew up with other kids around us, or maybe you're in first grade and some people that are in kindergarten. But when we think about small children, right, whether it's our siblings or something else, we see that they can get mad about things that are really kind of silly. And they may catch us kind of giggling about it and get madder. I remember my sister used to get upset about stuff that was just ridiculous, and I'd start laughing because, why would you be angry about that? And it would make her even more angry. Parents, tell stories about children getting mad because, the moon was in the sky during the day, or their ice cream was too cold, or, stuff that's just, ridiculous. It's not worth getting angry over. And unfortunately, we still struggle to resist anger as we grow up, right? That desire or that temptation to be angry about things that we can't control or that we don't understand doesn't necessarily go away as we grow up. And the reasons that we become angry really are still just as ridiculous sometimes. We can get angry over things like people chewing their food too loudly, or not being able to find the TV remote, or somebody asks a question that you just answered, or you have to come home at 10 p.m. on a school night, right? Those kinds of things can make you frustrated. They can make you upset. they can make you angry. And if we're honest with ourselves, we've become angry over something petty at least once in our lives. At other times, more serious matters push the anger button. Things like threats and lies and unjust actions. And so, we have to weigh, should we just give into that anger, or is there a better way? And in Psalm 35, we see that David has good reasons to be angry. But he too takes a different route. It's a route that we should consider when anger starts to well up inside of us. And so this morning we're going to look at Psalm 35 and kind of talk a little bit about anger. And so as we approach Psalm 35, we see that Psalm 35 is an imprecatory psalm, which is a kind of psalm that's very specific in nature, and it's a response to someone seeking to harm God's people. In these psalms, in these imprecatory psalms, we read of the psalmist asking God to bring death to the enemies, that God would break enemies' teeth, that their names would be removed from the book of life, and even that enemies' children would be crushed on the rocks. However, we must realize that these aren't responses to personal offenses. The enemies in these psalms are those who would seek not only to do God's people harm, but who oppose God himself. And so those people, their children would grow up to do the same. And the psalmists are asking that God would judge those who come against God and his people. What we read in the imprecatory psalms are not necessarily like, this is what God did. What we're reading in the imprecatory psalms is the feelings and the emotions of the psalmists. We're getting a glimpse into their hearts, into them bringing their anger and their frustration to God. Them crying out and saying, God, I wish you would do something because I'm so angry about what I see in the world. And that's the kind of psalm that Psalm 35 is. And so let's read that together. We're going to look at Psalm 35, verses 1 through 3. It says, oppose my opponents, Lord. Fight those who fight me. Take your shields, large and small, and come to my aid. Draw the spear and javelin against my pursuers, and assure me I am your deliverance. And so when we think about opposition, we see that opposition comes in many forms. We view anything that keeps us from what we want or what we think we deserve as opposition, and these things can stir up anger inside of us. We may get angry over small things, but David faced real and serious opposition. David likely wrote Psalm 35 during the period of his life when King Saul was pursuing him. After David's victory over Goliath, he quickly rose in popularity with the people. And the people even shouted, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. That's 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7. And though David never sought to take King Saul's place, that was not how Saul viewed David. God's hand was obviously on David. The prophet Samuel had already told Saul, your reign will not endure. The Lord has found a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people. And so David was the one that God had chosen to be the king of Israel. And even though David was loyal to Saul, Saul was jealous and paranoid and tried over and over again to kill him. Most of this was out of a desire to secure a family dynasty for his children, right? Saul didn't want David to become king. He wanted his own children to take the throne so that his family would rule over Israel for generations. And so David had to run for his life and lived in the wilderness as long as Saul was alive. Saul was constantly after David. And it's in this context that we see David cry out, "Oppose my opponents, Lord. Fight those who fight me." This is what we would call an imprecatory psalm, one in which the writer calls on God to bring harm and disaster on his enemy. And so as we kind of navigate this psalm, and imprecatory psalms can be difficult to read and hard to understand sometimes. And so in case we might think that David was hateful in writing Psalm 35, there are two things worth noting. One, David had multiple opportunities to kill his enemy, right? We've talked about this before in some of our Sunday school lessons, that David on multiple occasions has opportunities to kill Saul and chooses not to, because he is not going to take the life of one who he considers to be the Lord's anointed, right? David's position was, I don't like Saul. My life would be a lot easier without him, but God appointed Saul to be the king of Israel for this time, and it's not my position to take his life. And so what we see also here in Psalm 35 specifically is that David took the matter to God, that he didn't seek vengeance. Instead, he sought God. In this psalm, we see a cry for David's opponents to be disgraced, humiliated, ashamed, and ruined. David expressed his anger and frustration to God, but he left it there. And so, this leaves us with the question, how do we respond when we get angry, right? What's the takeaway here? A lot of people, when they get angry, will fume internally, right? They bottle that anger, they stir in it, they stew in it. Some people dream up creative ways to seek revenge. Others express their anger to other people, speaking unkindly about those who've angered them. But David here models a better approach, that even though he had reason to be angry, David left the matter up to God. And so I have two questions for you before we move on. One, what can we learn from the psalmist about prayer? And two, what might keep us from being honest with God about our anger? So next, let's look at Psalm 35. We're going to look at verses 13 through 16. It says, "Yet when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled myself with fasting, and my prayer was genuine. I went about mourning as if for my friend or brother. I was bowed down with grief like one mourning for a mother. But when I stumbled, they gathered in glee. They gathered against me. Assailants I did not know tore at me and did not stop. With godless mockery, they gnashed their teeth at me." And so, here we see David kind of crying out to God in frustration about what has happened to him. One application point, I think, here is that a lot of us in our teenage years, some of you guys are in them right now, have said, "I'm sure this time, this person is the one. This boyfriend, this girlfriend, like they are the person for me." But far too often, dating relationships end in bitter breakups, with one or both people involved becoming brokenhearted, devastated, or even blindsided. And this doesn't happen only in dating relationships. Sometimes good friends, even best friends, turn their backs on those they were once close to. And that's what we're seeing when we look at David talking about what's happened to him here in Psalm 35. And this is what made David's situation so difficult. The ones who were seeking to kill him were the very ones he cared for the most. Not only had David served Saul closely, his best friend was Saul's son, Jonathan. David had also been a military leader for Saul and had once served alongside many of the soldiers who were now pursuing him, who were now seeking to kill him on Saul's behalf. And so for those who think David was being unusually harsh in this psalm, they should note that David sincerely prayed for these men. He didn't casually pray in passing, and he certainly didn't say, as we often do, "I'll pray for you," and then forget. In the past, as a sign of mourning over their sickness, David had put on a sackcloth and fasted and prayed for them. Perhaps David had hoped that his friends would now do the same for him, that they would seek David's good out of their love for him when he struggled. But instead, they gathered in glee against him. Further, David's former friends invited other people to this kind of feeding frenzy that was being levied against David, right? That not only are David's friends after him, he says, assailants that I did not know tore at me and did not stop. When friends or family turn on us, it can be tempting to respond according to the ways in which we were treated. When Jesus spoke of loving our enemies, he said, "For if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what are you doing out of the ordinary?" That's Matthew chapter 5, verses 46 and 47. Even when our friends and loved ones turn on us, it's no excuse for us to act unkindly. Instead, what we're called to do is to continue loving those people. After all, this is the way that Jesus treats us. In fact, even when we were his enemies, Jesus died for us. And so we are never to respond in anger or retaliation. We are to respond in love. So I have another question for you before we move on. How can we respond well when we are treated in this way, right? When we feel betrayed, when we feel blindsided, when we feel attacked. How can we respond well and in a godly, Christ-honoring way? Next, let's look at Psalm 35, verses 17 through 18. It says, "Lord, how long will you look on? Rescue me from their ravages. Rescue my precious life from the young lions. I will praise you in the great assembly. I will exalt you among many people." So what we see when we look at the Old Testament is that Saul took his hatred of David to the battlefield and acted as a warrior. Because he perceived David to be his enemy, Saul chased him in order to kill him. David was well known as a mighty warrior himself, but in this case, he appealed to God to fight on his behalf. Without God's intervention, David's life was truly in danger, and David asked God to rescue him. And so for us, we need to pay attention to the fact that David prayed for rescue and not retaliation. He says, "Oppose my opponents. Let those be disgraced and humiliated. Let their way be dark and slippery. Let ruin come on him unexpectedly." You can see that in verses 1 through 8. And so underneath David's words in this psalm was a desire to be rescued. David's heart towards his enemy was evident at Saul's death. When Saul died in battle in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verses 1 through 6, David did not rejoice, saying, "Yes, my prayer's been answered." Instead, David grieved for Saul, as well as for Israel. You can see that in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 through 12. David had faith that God would rescue him. He just didn't know when. David was suffering, and he wanted God to rescue him right then. But David's trust in God was expressed in his patience. Even though David hadn't yet experienced the rescue that he so desperately wanted, he was still determined to honor God. Further, David offered his praise in the great assembly and among many people. To offer public praise in the middle of difficult and unfair circumstances is a great testimony of trust in God. We honor him when we choose to express trust rather than anger and retaliation. And so when we feel the tug of anger in our hearts, we can let it control our thoughts, our words, and our actions, or we can give it to God and leave matters in his hands. And so it's always better for others, for ourselves, and for the honor of God that we leave our anger and that we leave retaliation up to him. So I have 3 questions for you as we close. 1, why is it difficult to leave matters in God's hands? 2, how is God glorified when we do leave matters in his hands? And 3, what might it look like to conquer evil with good when it comes to the injustices in our lives, right? And so there are a lot of different ways that we can think through Psalm 35, that we can think through imprecatory psalms, and that we can think through the Christian response to anger. But in summary, I think what we should take away from these verses, right, what we can take away about anger from Scripture, right, is that anger is an emotion that we are going to feel, right? That anger is part of the human experience, that it's going to be impossible for us to never feel angry, right? The challenge for us as believers is what we do with that anger. We can choose to act on that anger, to respond to harsh treatment in similar kind, right? To say, they were nasty to me, so that gives me a license to be nasty to them. Right? We can respond in retaliation. We can try to fight fire with fire in that way, but that's not necessarily the Christian response. The Christian response is to take that anger to God. And prayer is a safe place for you to be able to let out your anger, for you to be able to cry out to God and say, God, I'm angry about what's happened to me. I'm angry about what I see in the world. You even can feel free to ask God to do something about it, right? That's what we see David doing here. He says, God, oppose my opponents. Let them be disgraced and humiliated. Let their way be dark and slippery. Let ruin come on them, right? It's okay to pray that prayer. But what you have to do when you do pray that prayer is to leave it there. To say, I have brought my anger to God. I have made my frustration known. I have lamented. I have cried out. It's over. God's going to do what God's going to do, and I'm going to let go of that anger that I've been feeling. However justified I may feel in that anger, it's time for me to let it go because I brought it to God. And this is something that's not easy, right? There are times in my life where I have struggled to do this very thing, right? And there are going to be times in your life where you're going to struggle to do this. But what I hope will be helpful for you moving forward is knowing that this is the Christian response, right? Knowing that this is the standard that we should strive towards. And that knowing it's going to be difficult to let go of that anger, even when you've brought it to God. But knowing that David did it, knowing that is what we're called to do, will hopefully be an encouragement to you in letting go of that anger when inevitably you do feel it. So I hope that this has been helpful for you, and I'll see you next week.